November 3, 1944, 0410. Metz smelled of wet ash and sweat. A low fog hugged the ruined roofs, and every step through the streets sent up the scrape of broken glass and the thin sour of cordite. Private First Class Michael Donovan lay in a collapsed bakery doorway, with his cheek pressed to the cold barrel of an M1903 Springfield fitted with an 8X scope. The optic offered a bright, narrow tunnel of a world. Straight ahead, clean crosshairs, a single distant alley framed like a throat. To either side, the rubble was a gray, blind blur. Before dawn that morning, Donovan had watched 2 men die in the space of minutes. James Bradley, a lean kid from Ohio with a laugh that came out of habit, had been on the roof and gone silent like someone had pulled a curtain. Robert Chen, steady-handed and patient, had half-turned to check a sound and never finished moving. Both were struck from angles that the scope could not see. Bradley fell without a sound. Chen's breath had stopped. The mud around him collected like a small, indifferent shore. Donovan had counted, then recounted, and the arithmetic did not lie. Their positions were being flanked. The German sharpshooters were not confronting them head-on. They were using the city's jagged geometry, peering through broken windows and chimneys and firing along lines crystal clear only to unshielded eyes. The Americans' choice had been to look straight. The enemy had chosen the sliver between straight and sight. Before the story unfolds, a small request. If you stay with this account to the end, consider leaving a like and subscribing. There are more untold, often overlooked moments of the war worth preserving. Donovan had been a competent marksman long before Metz. He was 22, quiet, hands rough from work back home, good with a file and a soldering iron, the sort of man who could make an extra part from a scrap. In the evenings he fixed watches for the platoon, or rigged a bent bayonet so a fellow soldier could eat without cutting his hand. He did not crave praise. He lived by a principle that had nothing to do with glory. The rifle must work because men depended on it. He began, like all technicians, by looking at what he already had. The M1903 Springfield in Donovan's hands was the standard sniper rifle of some American units, in late 1944. Long, heavy, accurate. The scope, an optical tube bolted to the receiver, gave 8 times magnification. That 8X made a distant barn window appear as a clear aperture, a black rectangle, a target. But 8 times magnification also meant a narrow field of view. Donovan likened it, in a cold joke later, to peering through a folded newspaper, precise in the middle, blind at the margins. On November nights, the difference between having a view and having only a point often meant life or death. Donovan had kept time, roughly, in his head. When an enemy twig snapped within the wide street, it could take 12 to 15 seconds, sometimes more, to realign the scope, find the sound in the view, estimate range, and place the shot. During those seconds, a flanker could crawl into a window, take a shot, and slip away while the shooter was still recalibrating. He thought about peripheral vision until it hurt. How do you preserve the consistency of a scoped aim and yet regain an awareness of the area the scope hides? The answer did not come as a single flash. It arrived as a string of fragments. A glance at a cracked rearview mirror clipped from a wrecked truck. The way, at home, his mother could see who stood in the doorway while keeping one hand on the stove. The mundane physics of reflections. Donovan was not the first soldier to adapt gear in the field. Improvisation was the unofficial verb of survival. But improvisation is often small and private. A wrapped rag here, a leather strap there. What Donovan began to build would be nothing extravagant. He scavenged a shard of glass from a window pane and spent a quiet hour filing it until the edge was smooth. He found a scrap of mirror glass, thin, slotted from a dresser he had passed in a bombed house, and tested it with a bit of wire and leather. In the crawl space behind the bakery, they worked by the light of a single carbide lamp, the bulb frowning small and brave against the fog. He fixed the mirror to the side of the scope at an angle so that, without moving his head much, his eye could catch the reflection of the flank. It was crude: a small metal frame, a length of braided wire, some fraying insulation from a radio cable used as a hinge, adhesive tape wrapped to prevent a sharp catch. Mechanically, the mirror did one thing and did it well. It turned the plane of view sideways. When Donovan's eyes stayed in the scope, the crosshair remained. A sliver of the mirror just outside the scope tube showed the reflection of areas beyond the direct line of fire. It did not make the rifle omniscient. It widened the cone by degrees. It created a second mirrored cone of sight that could be scanned in a few quick moments. There was risk in fiddling with a weapon. A jury-rigged attachment could fail at the wrong time. Worse, it could be seen as tampering with issued equipment, drawing the attention of inspectors who cared more for regulations than for the lives behind the rifles. Donovan thought of rules, and then thought of Bradley and Chen. Rules were written on paper. Bullets disregarded paper. He did not go to his captain and ask for permission. He was a private by rank and a mechanic in practice. The unit's chain of command moved slowly, and a slow chain cannot keep men safe while they die. The first installations were clandestine. Night after night he worked quietly.
In the hotel-turned-ruin on Rue de la Halle, the building's upper floor caved in, letting in the moon. He whispered to Martinez while the other men slept in corners, and Martinez, 20 and quick to grin even under stress, kept lookout. "Think it'll actually see anything?" Martinez asked once, his breath hanging white in the lamp glow. Donovan held the scope with the small mirror and let Martinez peer through. On the mirror's surface, a partial view of a side street glinted. The reflection was backward and odd, but where before there had been nothing in the periphery, there was now a picture. Martinez drew back slowly, like a man who had seen enough to be surprised into silence. "If it can't save a head," Martinez said, "it can at least make the shooter think twice." When they first took it out on patrol, the device did not impress. The mirror was slight, the reflection dim when clouded with breath or rain. The early field tests were incremental, spotting a dog slip behind a wall, noticing the shimmer of a boot moving across rubble where the scope saw only an empty alley. But those moments were significant. Each small save was proof that the concept worked. The mirror did not substitute for situational awareness. It augmented it. The moment that proved its worth came on the third week of November near the ruined bakery on Rue de Marché. Intelligence had reported increased enemy sniper activity around a small factory complex, and the bakery provided an advantageous vantage. The platoons set up in two positions, Donovan with Martinez on the north side and a pair of infantrymen covering the southern approach. The thin morning mist made the world a watercolor painting of gray edges. The Germans had been silent, perhaps mowing the streets with a light patience. Time moved with the deliberate slowness of men waiting for action. Donovan's hands were steady on the stock. His cheek was familiar with the metal's cold. Martinez's fingers traced the tape around the mirror mount, as if testing a seam. They had agreed on a signal. A short double tug on the wire would mean flank. A single tug that was more of a comfort, "I've got you." Out of the fog came a soft sound, like someone closing a book. Donovan's ear pricked. The scope showed nothing. He glanced at the mirror. In its glass, a shadow moved inside the bakery's shattered window. A man had slipped to the flank. If Donovan had relied solely on the scope, he would have turned, raised the rifle, lost sight for a full 10 seconds while finding the target. Those 10 seconds might have been enough for his head to be taken. He gave the double tug. Martinez reacted. In less time than the full turn of a watch, Martinez's rifle spoke. The crack was small but final. The figure crumpled at the window's edge. Seconds later, another flash from a higher arch, another flanker, was visible only when the mirror caught the angle of a rifle barrel through the broken masonry. 2 more shots, 2 more men down. The bakery, which had been a locus of danger, became a scene of sudden, grim clarity. In the span of a minute, the mirror had turned potential ambush into identifiable threats. For the men who were not paying attention, the moment looked almost accidental. For Donovan, it was a confirmation, hard and precise, of the design's value. He felt an odd mix of relief and a renewed heaviness in his chest, the way a man feels when he realizes that an immediate danger has passed, but that the war still presses in. Word of the device spread down the platoon faster than anyone would have expected. Martinez kept his mouth shut about Donovan's role in front of others. He wanted the device to be used, not remembered. Sergeant Frank Wilson, who had the blunt pragmatism of a man who had survived too many winters, eyed the contraption and then ordered his own men to keep still and listen. The pattern was informal at first. A mirror here, a polished lens there, a strap borrowed from a gas mask to hold it in place. Different men adapted the mount to their own rifles. Duct tape, a ring of leather, a soldered wire brace, material currency in the field. Not everyone approved. A supply sergeant grumbled about non-standard parts. An ordnance man muttered about potential liability and optics warranty, vocabulary that in the field translated to bureaucratic trouble. But Captain Robert Hayes held a different calculus. Hayes was a company commander who had spent nights awake counting the faces of his men and saw that regulations were thin things next to survival. When the captain learned what Donovan had done, he did not call for an inspection. He called Donovan to his tent. "You didn't tell me," Hayes said quietly, folding a map by the lamplight. He had the look of a man who had read more than his share of casualty lists. Donovan shrugged. He expected to be reprimanded. He expected a lecture on discipline. He did not expect Hayes's steady, almost tired gratitude. "Keep doing it," Hayes said, "but keep it low. I'll see to it that you don't get blamed if something goes wrong. If anyone asks, say the idea came from a man in another platoon." Hayes's protection was practical as much as moral. A senior request from a company commander could keep ordnance off the trail, and Hayes preferred to have tools working than to have his men entangled in memos. He arranged for spare mirror fragments to be sent along in small packages labeled as spare glass, and briefed his sergeants on how to install the mounts without needing a formal requisition. The distribution became an unofficial protocol. If you were a shooter, you received a mirror. By late November, the device had turned up mounted on rifles across the battalion. Where it could be used, casualties from lateral angles decreased noticeably. Men who previously had to withdraw from overwatch positions to clear flanks could now hold them longer. Patrol leaders reported fewer flanking ambushes and fewer sudden, silent deaths in positions thought secure. Where the mirror could not be used, inside cramped interiors or where glass would not reflect the proper angle, the old risks remained. The device was not a cure-all. It was a specific, effective adaptation to a specific problem. Still, despite the practical gains, the official channels that recorded innovation moved more slowly than danger. On paper, in formal after-action notes, a battalion report by an ordnance inspector named Abedin later summarized the field expedients as unit adaptations, a phrase that flattened individuals into collective action. The report emphasized procedure and cautioned against unauthorized modification. Names were scarce. Donovan's are small letters on big pages. Donovan kept working, keeping his head down in the weeks that followed. At night he thought of Bradley and Chen. He thought of their faces and of the small mechanics of how a bullet had taken a body from a man who was, minutes before, part of a joke or a plan. Guilt drove him as much as practical need. He had a peculiar certainty that if he could reduce the arithmetic of death even by a handful, some pattern of human cost could be shifted. When the fighting around Metz eased and the unit moved on in early December, the mirror followed in different guises. Soldiers adapted it to local needs.
Wilson, who later became a hunting guide in peacetime, would tell a neighbor decades after the war how the device saved his life in a quarry job that felt oddly like those Met streets. "We weren't inventors," he'd say. "We were survivors making do." Martinez took a mirror with him into the police force back home, where he later used the quiet talent of vigilance to spot dangers on midnight beats. Each man carried with him a sliver of glass and a memory that was at once private and communal. Outside the battlefield, the wheels of military bureaucracy rolled toward an evaluation. Abedin's assessment, never ill-intentioned but procedural, recommended that the armory examine approved mounts for opticians. It included diagrams and a caution about the potential of altered sight alignment. What it did not do was single out the young private who had first affixed the mirror. Hayes, when asked later, insisted the invention was a sergeant's idea or a unit-level adaptation. The choice to ascribe the idea to the unit was in part protective. It kept Donovan from a disciplinary hearing and kept the device in the field. But it also meant that records would not bear his name. Donovan did not demand credit. After the war, as routines shifted from war to work, he favored quietness. He returned to a factory in Pennsylvania where his hands made parts that would never be name-checked in reports. He married a woman named Elsie, who liked his clean way of washing himself of mud and
smoke. He rarely spoke of the war in full. When asked about his time overseas, he would say, with a small, practiced smile, that he had done what needed doing. To the occasional veteran who recognized the mirror's footprint in a photo or an old Springfield, he would shrug and say that it belonged to the men who used it. But history, even when it neglects, has ways of circling back on itself. Years later, an archivist sorting through equipment at a small museum associated with Fort Benning came across a Springfield with a peculiar mount. A small mirrored plate still held in place by tape that had yellowed with age. The artifact was catalogued under a generic tag, Field Modified Springfield 1944, and not much more. It spent a decade in a storeroom until a visiting historian, curating a show on battlefield ingenuity, noticed the mount's specific angle and the crude but effective workmanship. The historian traced threads: oral histories from Martinez and Winson, a footnote in Abedin's report that mentioned reflective expedients, and a faded photograph in a corporal's pocket of a scope with something glued to the side. Names began to align. The historian found Donovan's name in a roster, then in a letter written home that mentioned his mechanical tinkering. A small chain of testimonies, each hesitant and fragmentary, converged. Donovan had been the main craftsman. The museum mounted the Springfield in the main exhibit with a modest plaque that, after some deliberation and a request from a veterans group, read, "Springfield, M1903, field adaptation credited to Private Michael Donovan and his unit." It was not the headline Donovan had never wanted, and the recognition arrived decades later when Donovan had already grown old and the hair on his head had thinned like a battlefield dawn. He came to the opening quietly, sat near the back, and watched as strangers murmured at the glass. Recognition in a museum does not undo what was lost in Metz, the lives that ended or the faces that do not return. But it redrew the outline of a story that had been flattened in official pages. For Donovan, the moment of public acknowledgement was small and private at once. He listened to the speeches with the patience of a man who knew that names were fragile things, and that life was measured in acts more than in records. There was another cost, subtler, the erasure that happens not from malice but from the fog of large systems. Abedin's report had been careful, perhaps too careful so far as individual credit went. Hayes had protected lives, and in doing so, made choices about what would appear in the record. Donovan accepted this, partly because he preferred the quiet life he had built, and partly because he, like many who had seen too much death, held memories as private ledgers, not meant for public display. The mirror itself became the motif of the story, small, reflective, able to show what had been hidden. In the hands of soldiers who had only seconds to decide, a trivial scrap of glass had altered outcomes. It had turned unseen threats into targetable ones. It had cost nothing grand. It had saved lives in increments. When Donovan died years later, old enough to have been spared the burdens of youthful urgency, Martinez stood quietly at the funeral. He had become what he once imagined, a man who had used a mirror and then spent a life watching for danger in the daylight. He kept nothing from the war, except a photograph of the bakery, a citation from a captain who had never used the word inventor, and the tracks of a name in a museum catalog. The narrative of Metz, like many battlefield stories, balanced between abrupt, violent episodes and the slow machinery of memory. Men who had seconds from death were sometimes obliged to do something that seemed, to their friends, almost insane. Affix a mirror to a rifle and trust that a sliver of reflection could stand between a man and a bullet. The seeming craziness of the act was the point. It was low technology, immediate, and born of grief. When it worked, it was both miracle and arithmetic. There was one engagement, still to come in this account, that would crystallize the mirror's tactical worth and force the battalion's officers to choose between secrecy and dissemination. It would be the moment when the device moved from private practice into the lore of the company, and when the human consequences, saved lives, altered careers, and the bureaucratic choices that followed, would become impossible to ignore. Donovan, who had thought only in terms of keeping men alive long enough to see another dawn, would face a choice of his own: insist on recognition or accept the small, quiet victory of having done what needed doing. He stood in the ruined bakery doorway once more, the cool of November biting through his coat, the mirror at his side catching the weak morning light. He remembered Bradley and Chen with a steadiness that had the shape of duty. He could, he told himself, keep the men next to him from becoming numbers. Ahead lay a test that would prove whether a simple piece of glass could change the calculus of war. He breathed in the fog, tasted the metallic tang of readiness, and tightened his grip on the rifle. He waited until the last blue edge of dawn had peeled back from the roofs, and the men began to move like a troop of old clocks resetting themselves. The company formed in the street, muffled boots, the clink of gear, breath made visible and quick, and Donovan felt the mirror warm against the leather strap at his belt. He had lashed it there with greasy twine the night before, the glass edge taped with a strip of cloth so it would not cut the hand that might, in panic, fumble for it. They crossed the square in twos, low-headed beneath the arch of a shattered statue. The town beyond Metz lay in pieces, a gray pattern of collapsed chimneys and blackened window frames, each opening a possible eye for an enemy. It was one thing to imagine the mirror saving a man on a patrol. It was another for it to be the pivot of an entire advance, to turn an assault from a roll of doom into a slow, measured slide toward safety. Donovan and Martinez moved together, as they always did when the orders came down. Martinez had the steady, slow breathing of a man who had learned to count his pulses. He kept his rifle angled, the mirror ready on his left side like an afterthought of light. They had practiced in the ruins with the little sliver of glass until the motion became weaponized habit. Lift, angle, catch a slice of reflection from a pane, and the eye would tell them the window held a shape that did not belong. Someone crouched, someone watching. They were not the only ones with tricks. The enemy had learned to darken glass, to hang ragged curtains, to set men behind bricked embrasures. But there remained, even in the most careful positions, the human tendency to blink and expose what the hunter hid. A shaft of sun could find a mirror in the hand of a farmer's wife miles away. A rifle barrel glinting at the wrong moment could betray a whole gaggle of death. The company moved through a narrow lane, and then the square opened like the throat of some sleeping animal. Men shouldered forward. Donovan felt the old throttle of fear tighten in his chest, old because it was worn into him by 1,000 small alarms. And in the center of the square, a single window held a pale suggestion of light. It was nothing to the unlearned eye,
a fleck, a hairline sheen. Donovan saw it for what it was. He whispered a signal to Martinez and shifted left. Martinez answered with a motion of his jaw and a barely perceptible shift of stance. Ahead, Corporal Hayes, now Lieutenant Hayes in charge of the platoon, had given the order to spread and take cover behind the fountain's broken basin. Hayes had the face of a man who had given and taken hard choices. His eyes were quick to measure a risk. Donovan worked the mirror as if stroking a small animal. He raised his rifle, the mirror held at an angle above the barrel, and glanced for the reflected curve of glass in the window. The sliver showed him what the naked eye couldn't: a shadow against the far sill, the dark slope of a cheek, the pale glint of a scope. Donovan did not shout. He tapped his boot twice. A single man across the square, a sniper, had the square's center in his sights. He had chosen that position for its clear field and the illusion of safety. Now he was visible by the sliver of reflected sun on his scope. Martinez,
2 steps to Donovan's right, did not hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired once, the crack chopping through the square like a bone. The sniper fell back, unseen by others, his shot wasted on the empty air where a column had just been. It was smaller than Donovan had imagined. One man, then another, then the sudden revelation of a whole line of heads at other windows as men, drawn by the initial volley, peered out. The mirror had been a spark. In one precise, explosive minute, the square turned from a trap into a field of sight. Men who would have moved in uncertainty instead moved with a map in their minds. Windows that held life were now marked by the quick blink of reflected glass. The enemy tried to answer with a heavy burst from behind a collapsed bakery wall to the left. Shrapnel and dust spewed. Men ducked. Someone screamed. Donovan felt the ricochet kiss his shoulder. It stung like nettles, and he tasted blood. But the mirror had already done what it could do. It had made the enemy visible, and visibility in war is a fate as mortal as any bullet. The company pressed the advantage. With each sweep of the mirror, a new hazard was catalogued and neutralized. It was not miraculous in the cinematic sense. It was arithmetic and timing and the very human thing of noticing first. Somewhere on the right, a machine gun crew attempted to wheel into position. A quick flash off a spent cartridge indicated their nest. Donovan signaled Hayes by tapping his palm to his thigh. Hayes snapped a hand gesture to a grenadier who had been trained to take such positions. 2 throws later, the machine gun's nest was a tangle of steel and cries. The company advanced. Not all dangers were answered. A mortar landed in the churchyard and took 3 men. Bradley and Shen had been names embedded in Donovan's private ledger. He thought of them at once, the neat way each man's life had slotted into his memory like a ledger entry. He had always thought the mirror could not bring them back. But it could, he told himself, make sure that more ledgers remain, more mornings were lived. When the firing eased and the square had been cleared, the company pressed on into the deeper parts of the town, through collapsed awnings and into a street that ran between 2 rows of houses. Here the enemy had chosen to fight in house-to-house fashion, slamming doors and opening windows only to toss in a grenade and retreat. The mirror changed tactics into a different kind of patience. A way to watch the horizon of a doorframe without exposing the body that might have to deliver the shot. By noon, the town had been taken. The man who could stand did so, shaking dust from their clothes and trading the rare, awkward smiles of men who had survived. A quarter of the company would be later sent to the field. Hospital for shrapnel and fever. The rest gathered in the shadow of the town hall, and an officer began to write the report. Hayes, clean-faced despite the day's grime, came straight to Donovan. He put a hand on Donovan's shoulder with a firmness that was both thanks and command. "You were steady," Hayes said. He paused as if measuring the right word. It worked. Donovan kept his face an unreadable map. "We all did what we could," he replied. Saying less had become his armor. Hayes did not ask him to elaborate on the improvised device. He didn't need to. In Hayes's mind, the fact of the instrument and the fact of its success opened a corridor of consequence. If word of the mirror spread, the army might adopt it and save thousands. If the enemy learned quickly, they might adapt just as fast, darkening glass, rigging false glints to lure men into traps. There were more calculations than the single human one of whether to publish a method that could save lives. The captain assigned to write the after-action report, a man named Abedin, meticulous in dress and in language, stood near the makeshift table and dipped his pen. Abedin had seen enough operations to know that words shaped the future. He listened as Hayes sketched the sequence: window lights, the snap of a sight, the neutralization of the sniper. He noted the ordnance used and the positions taken. Donovan's mirror was a detail threaded through the account like a silver stitch. "There are things we do not make public," Abedin said quietly, looking up from his notes. He did not address Donovan directly, but the words were aimed at the same place. Standard practice. If a method becomes widespread knowledge, the enemy adapts, lives are lost. Donovan felt a sudden small fury that had nothing to do with himself, and everything to do with those who might yet stand in the open, ignorant of a way to see. "Then we teach at the company level," he said. "We show the men how to look. We keep it off the map of official dispatches." Hayes nodded, slow. He measured the cost of official recognition against the immediate good of life in his platoon. "We can do that," he said. "Informal dissemination. Keep it from the telegraph." Abedin frowned. "But when the War Office asks—" "It will be a field adaptation," Hayes cut in, "a local measure. We tell them what they need to know. The town was taken, casualties and equipment seized. We do not hand them a blueprint that the enemy can study. For now, it remains a company-level practice." Donovan wanted to argue that the War Office, with its reach, could teach battalions what a mirror could do, and thus save thousands. He wanted to stand and say that he had made the thing, and that it was a small miracle of craft and care. He wanted, in a simple human way, the ledger of his life to be lined with the truth of his hands. But he was also a man who had learned restraint. He had watched command make decisions that kept men alive in one place and sent more to die somewhere else. He had seen the grain of good shrivel when run through the sieve of higher strategy. He thought of Bradley and Chen. He thought of the quiet graves and the small funerals. He thought of the comfortable life he had cobbled after the war, the bakery photograph, the single citation, the days when he could wake and not have the taste of gun oil in his mouth. "Keep it with the company," Donovan said finally. "Teach the men. Don't put my name in a dispatch." Hayes looked as if he would argue, then nodded. "As you wish," he said. "But I will mention there was a field adaptation credited to a member of your unit. The higher-ups demand something on paper." That balance between an honest ledger and the prudence of secrecy set the tenor for what came next. Abedin composed a report that was careful in its praise and parsimonious in detail. He described the method as an on-site adaptation utilizing reflective sighting for identification of concealed shooters. And in the margins, he underlined the phrase operational confidentiality. He wrote the names of the dead with solemn neatness. He listed Donovan's contribution as company-level innovation and left the line for inventor blank. In the weeks that followed, the company taught the method in small clusters. A man demonstrating the tilt and catch, another passing the twine for fastening, a youngster learning where to aim the light. The mirror became part of the routine. It slid into the pockets of men who had once carried talismans and good luck coins. It was not a secret kept with malice. It was a quiet thing hoarded because the world itself in war is an oracle of trade-offs. Donovan watched the practice spread with a private satisfaction that had the warmth of a hearth. He did not push for more. He refused the small promotions that followed, rumors of his steadiness in action.
He came to see recognition as a clumsy instrument, too blunt for the delicate mechanics that saved a life. To be named in a dispatch would have been fine in some other story. In this one, anonymity felt truer. It kept him from the public ledger and allowed him to carry in the raw privacy of his memory the faces of those he had tried to keep. There were consequences. Command, curious about the report, suggested a review by an engineering detachment. Requests for more detailed accounts were routed through Hayes and answered with the practiced vagueness of Abidine's pen. At the tactical school the following winter, the method, stripped of names and shorn of the simple human touch that had refined it in a ruined bakery, was presented as a field exercise to officers. It made a neat chapter in a manual. The cadets practiced angles in the bright safety of a lecture hall, and later, far from Metz, tried the motion in controlled drills. The method's vitality dimmed in translation, but its essence, light making the invisible visible, was preserved enough to be taken up in other skirmishes. Donovan watched the slow journey of his mirror's idea as if it were a creature he had once nursed and then let loose. It moved through the machine of bureaucracy and out into the cold currents of doctrine, changing shape as it went. He was neither triumphant nor embittered. He was, as ever, someone whose measure was the men who still lived because a sliver of glass had told them where not to stand. Later, when Abedin wrote a private note, small, tucked into his desk drawer, he called Donovan's action instrumental in limiting casualties in Metz. He did not sign it as a formal endorsement for publication. He sent the field report up the line marked "For Command Eyes Only." Hayes kept Donovan's name from the Telegraph as he had promised, and the War Office filed the document under operational adaptation, without the personal detail that might invite public scrutiny. Donovan returned to the ruined bakery at dusk some days hence, alone, to stand in the doorway with the mirror tucked against his chest. He thought of Bradley and Chen and the other faces that clustered in his ledger. He thought of how small instruments had reshaped the answer to a question, who survives? He thought about later years, about a life spent repairing ovens and laying bricks, and of the odd canyon that forms between a singular act in war and the slow, indifferent machinery of memory. He could have insisted on his name. He could have demanded a citation that would hang on a wall and be read aloud at parades. But he kept his ledger private. The mirror remained a motif, a way of seeing what had been hidden, and his hand, which had once fastened it to a rifle with twine, unlearned the need for applause. The town of Metz, which had lost faces and gained strange reputations, folded the story of that morning into its own long list of absences and survivals. Months later, an officer from the tactical school visited the company to learn what had been done. He watched Donovan demonstrate the angle, the catch of reflected light. He asked practical questions about the tape, the twine, and the best shape for the glass. He took notes, precise and clinical, and left with a small approving nod. That meeting would become one of the many nodes through which the technique, first a personal act of preservation, would pass into broader service. Still, the name stuck only in a few private ledgers, Donovan's own, Martinez's, Abedin's marginalia. The question of recognition remained suspended, like dust motes in a shaft of afternoon light, visible, comforting, and ultimately unresolvable. Donovan would, in the long sweep of his life, accept the quiet closing of that question. He would let the neat, impersonal, and convenient. He would carry, instead, the knowledge that a scrap of glass had once turned a square of doom into an inventory of saved men. He would listen to the murmur of names at a museum opening in a future he could not yet imagine and feel that odd compensation that sometimes comes when small truths are allowed, finally, to be seen. For now, there remained the matter of the town, the wounded, and the letters soldiers wrote home in the raw hours after battle. Donovan found Martinez among a cluster of men cleaning weapons, and the two of them shared a silence that was neither heavy nor light. They had been given another dawn. They had also borne the tally of what had been paid. "Do you regret not telling them?" Martinez asked at last, voice low as the scrape of a key. Donovan considered it. The mirror was at his side, a dull thing against his hip. "I regret things that I cannot change," he said, "but not this. This kept men alive." Martinez nodded and returned to his work, hands steady as if the act of cleaning were a kind of prayer. They left Metz in weeks, the company moving on as armies do, from one displaced town to another. The mirror moved with them, carried in pockets and pouches, taught to new hands with the soft exactness of someone teaching a child to read. It passed from man to man, from ration to ration, from rumor to practice, and in each new iteration it retained a piece of its origin. The bakery doorway, the cold November light, the small, stubborn decision of a private to make a scrap of glass into a shield. Months later, when Abedini prepared a condensed briefing for the brigade staff, he included a single footnote about field innovations observed. He recommended limited dissemination and training at the company level, noting the danger of widespread publication. Hayes made sure his name did not appear in the graded dispatch. Donovan read the summary in a drafty tent by lamplight and folded the paper into his pocket, as if tucking away a photograph. The debate between secrecy and sharing would continue in hushed corridors, in reports sent up the chain, and in the scribbled notes of aides who never saw the streets where the method was born. It would take years for the record to be disinterred, for historians and museum curators to track the story through marginalia and private letters. An exhibit placard much later would finally make room for a name, his name, but that was not a future Donovan tried to predict. That night, back in the quiet of what passed for barracks, Donovan unrolled an old photograph of a bakery he had carried through the war. He smoothed the creases with a fingertip. The mirror lay beside it on the table, catching the lantern light and breaking it into a dozen lenses.
Small, harmless glints. He watched them and remembered the faces, the angles, the suppression, and the saving. He had kept no other invention, no patent, no claim. He had kept a ledger of men who returned. Outside, the buzz of flies and the thin, persistent sounds of a camp settling into sleep rose and fell like a tide. Donovan put the mirror into his palm and for a long moment let himself imagine a world in which every hidden window would be met with a similar flash of care. He did not expect the world to become that way. He only hoped that, in some scattered places and at some small cost, lives might be spared. He wrapped the mirror in cloth and slid it into his breast pocket, close to his heart, in a way that was foolish and exact. Then he lay down and let the dark come, thinking of small instruments and the strange arithmetic of war.